No, it's working? Okay.
Okay, this is
No.
to record the talks.
What is the organization? Is CIA or so? What?
Está ligado, sí.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Hilda, and also the other organizers for bringing me here. I'm very happy and to see a lot of friends again, to be in Sao Paulo. And I will talk today a bit application of complex networks to the climate system. So let me go ahead. And I'm, to answer your point, I have a joint position in a research institute on climate impact research at Humboldt University in Berlin. The question is, can we, from complex system science, help people in earth science? Let me make shortly. And can we reduce the light here in front a bit? Is it possible? Only in the front? Not in the back? This is work with several people from my group in Potsdam. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. But also with other people, all these star people are former PhD students, which are of mine, which are around the world. And we have also, of course, specialists from climatology from Brazil, José Marengo, Enrique Barbosa, but also from Europe, Brian Hoskins and Henk Dijkstra. And later this week, Jelena Zurovyatkina will also give a talk, especially on the monsoon system. And the contents is first some introduction, then I will explain what climate networks are, and then go to a special case, how we can analyze extreme events in the climate system from this viewpoint. And this is not correct, I will give then an application to South America. And some key piece of this work was published this February in Nature. I know some people do not like this journal, but I have worked now for 10 years in climate networks, and also other people have worked, and this is the first paper on this topic in Nature. It was not so easy to bring through, I can tell you. But we publish also in other journals. So, of course, you all know that complex networks have, in some sense, origin in social networks, as is Facebook, also where we can study opinion formation, spreading, and so on. I think this will be discussed in further talks. But I will go to System Earth. System Earth, I hope you accept, is also a complex system. We have several subsystems, the ocean, atmosphere, cryosphere, land and surface, and we are in the middle of all of this. And in some sense, we are now on the way to destroy all structure formation which happened beforehand. But what is more important for us is that you have a lot of feedbacks among the subsystems. Only one unidirectional thing is the energy from the sun. All the others is a lot of feedbacks, and this is a strong indication for a highly complex system. But of course, I know this is a continuous system, mainly continuous system. As one can say, is in some sense a flow system. And there are important challenges these days. One is the impacts of climate change. For instance, I think in this room all people accept that we have climate change. Not you, I think your president or whatever is not accepting this, of course. But there are other presidents as well. But we here accept this, and the question is then, what is the impact and what are feedbacks? As if you make more deforestation in the Amazon, which impact has this on the whole system Earth, on the future climate, etc.? This is a strong challenge to study. And another one is to study extreme events, floods, landslides, droughts, typhoons, and especially are they predictable? And I will focus mainly on the second aspect later. And what is also typical for such a complex system as the brain, you have oscillations at various scales, and they are interacting. This is some kind of a power spectrum which was decomposed from various information, not by myself, by other people, is accepted, and you see a lot of peaks from a really very small time scale up to 400,000 years. This is the longest which is here. And you see there are only two small band, narrow band one. This is the daily and the annual. All the others are rather broadband. This is one indication of nonlinearity, and the other is you have a very strong, what some engineers call noise floor. But this is an indication that these oscillations are interacting. You have not isolated annual peak, for instance. And this is one indication. And now we try to approach via complex networks this climate system. It looks maybe a bit strange, but the climate, I mentioned before, is a flow system, and we could consider this as a flow network. And we have other flow networks. The circulation, for instance, in our body is a flow network, and there are many other such things. And this is a keyword which combines a bit. And the point is now, how can we come to a network structure? And the idea is that there is a backbone underlying the climate system. As we try to reconstruct from this continuous system a discretization, a discretized description of the system. And this is, of course, a different kind of discretization as a typical one with the nearest neighbors or Gayorkin with modes or so. We look here really for neighbors at all scales. And then the hope is that this way we can answer some questions with these techniques which are impossible to solve with others. We will not replace all the others, for sure not, but maybe we find some task which we can better study via complex networks. So, and to make it more operational, this is our system Earth, and we assume that we have observations at all these local sites. And these local sites, these dots, if you wish, or subregions, are considered as nodes in our system. Now we have observations, that means temperature, precipitation, pressure, wind, or whatever the typical climate observations are. And then we have this time series from different regions, and we make then a causality analysis among them. And if there is a significant causality among such time series, then among two nodes, then we make a connection. In this way, the network is created. A very simple idea, and what you can get immediately are so-called infer long-range connections. They are called teleconnections in the climate system. And here is an example where the strongest connections are shown, and you see most are in the equatorial area, but also connecting the poles from the equator. This is in principle what you have to expect, but already to get such connectivity is of high importance for climatologists. One can do then also some other projections, which what is called visual analytics, and then you can play a lot of things. And this looks great. Very nice finding. But when you start a new thing with new methods, there, I think, are always problems with possible artifacts and misinterpretations. And you have the same problem, which we have here in neuroscience, in physiology, biology, and finances. Namely, to give two basic problems. This is, look here at this very simple network consisting of 4 nodes, X, Y, Z, W. And we have a connection between X and Y and Z, and Y and W. If you have now a time series at these 4 nodes and make classic cross-correlation or mutual information analysis, then it turns out as a result that X and Z and W are also connected. But they are not. They are only indirectly connected via this way, and here they have the common driver. And one really would avoid to have these indirect connections that they come out as direct ones. This is a very simple to formulate problem, but not so easy to treat. And we have developed in the direct way some techniques to avoid these things, some nonlinear techniques. And let me give the main steps. In the first step, you have such a high dimensionality. You saw so many nodes and so many time series. Therefore, first, we try to reduce the dimensionality with classic method via principal components. This is the idea behind a lot of subtle techniques. And then in the second step, we consider as nodes now only these clusters, which we get as main components, and then study what is the connectivity among these clusters, which is much less dimensional. But then you can have not only one pathway between two nodes, but several pathways, and then you have to identify the strongest or most probable pathway. And if you have done all this analysis, then the crucial step comes. Now you have to go to climatology. Does it make sense what you have found? Is it a confirmation? Is it nonsense? Or does it give a new insight? And let me give here a sketch for this. We have here our observations, then reduced, say here in this case, to 6 clusters. And then we make this connectivity analysis and find different ways. And if you look here, for instance, from X to Y, you can go this way, you can go this way, but you can also go this way. And due to some circumstances, the surface of the Earth or so, this way is the most probable one. And that's the idea, how to find. And let me give now one example to make it a bit clearer. I told you always that we have observations at all these dots. Of course, we do not have. There are no stations in the ocean, in the pole areas. And this is an old problem in climatology, but what they are doing is they construct so-called reanalysis data. And that means they take all observational data and take then also simulated data and make a very subtle data assimilation techniques, apply them, and construct such data that you have real data on all these points. They are called reanalysis data. There are a few well-accepted ones. They are also available. You can download. We took them from Boulder in this case. And in this case, we took the surface pressure. This goes back till 48. You have here 2.5 degrees spatial resolution in both directions. That means we have about 10,000 grid points. And the time series on each of the grid points with weekly data consist of a bit more than 3,000 points. And it's already something like a big data problem. So then we made this first step and found then 60 strongest clusters, if you wish. And most of these clusters can be interpreted from the ENSO, this El Nino, La Nina phenomenon with the monsoon, etc. But now we consider only a very simple problem. How is the motion, how is the flow going from the central Pacific, which is especially ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation area, to the monsoon area? And then we made this analysis and found that there are several routes, several pathways, possible pathways, and it turns out that this one, via the Indonesian archipelago, is the most probable one. And this looks very simple, but was not known to climatologists. This was really important for them to know that this is a typical flow, the typical pathway. So one can do, and we have done a lot of other things, but let me come now to the extreme events. And here I have a motto from Richard Feynman: test of science is its ability to predict. Also let's see whether our approach helps in prediction of extreme events, and is maybe even better. And of course, weather and climate prediction and extreme event prediction is a long-lasting challenge. There was really a big jump, in some sense a revolution, started by Luiz Frei Richardson. He was the first to propose to make weather prediction by numerical processes. That means taking the physical equations, Navier-Stokes equation, and a lot more things, and make numerical analysis for weather prediction. This was published in 1922, but it was too early. You could not apply this because no computers available. That means we had to wait till Johann von Neumann has created a good enough computer, and then he applied this. He was a very bright guy, we all know about, also in this direction, and he was the first to make them real weather forecast based on the idea of Richardson in 1950. And then a lot of progress has been done via combination of techniques from data assimilation, from computer science, and nonlinear dynamics techniques. This was really a very strong and interesting merging or interaction of both areas. And this is what we have now, our weather forecast based on the so-called global circulation models. This works well, but has some drawback. The prediction horizon of this is maximum 2 weeks. That's a big problem. And now is and some extreme events are not predictable at all. And this is now one of the most important challenges to go beyond the 2 weeks. We have a joint, yes, let me say graduate colleague, people understand easier, a European graduate colleague, which we have started, this spring, I think, where Christina is the main engine of this. And our main intention is to go beyond 2 weeks from different aspects and with about 10 or 12 groups. So I will show you some results which are going in this direction, also going beyond 2 weeks. And the question is, can complex climate network help here? So first is we have to treat extreme events. This we cannot do directly with the method I showed before, especially if you think about strong rainfall. Then you have a lot of zeros, and zeros are terrible in every time series analysis because it's not rainy every day. Therefore, we are looking for another approach, and some people know me, and you can imagine we always try to do some synchronization things. And this is what we call event synchronization. And I will come to this. We were not the first with this idea. This was by Mario in neuroscience, the first idea, but this will be shown later. But what is the main idea? We have here precipitation in region A during some time here in region B. Then extreme events is a broad word. In hydrology, they consider already the 10% strongest events as extreme. It is as it is. I will not comment on this. And usually we consider the 10 up to 1% strongest events as very strong or severe events, if you wish. Also here, all what is above the red line is extreme, in this case. Then we look where are the maxima, and now the crucial step are coming. We are looking now whether the maxima of this very strong event in region A and B happen almost at the same time, not exactly. This is, I learned that in Curitiba yesterday was strong rain, and it's coming here now. Also it's not at the same time. And therefore you have some corridor, some window in time, usually plus minus 3 days or so. And if this is in this window, then we argue that these events are synchronized, they happen at the same time. And you see this is in this sketch here, and here the case. And we make a connection between the two regions if this happens not only one, but significantly often. So, and now let me give again a short thing. We have also 2 regions, 2 observations, make then all this synchronization test and also test whether it was often enough. And you see here, this is also the very first paper on this. And Then if this is really significantly often, then we construct an adjacency matrix, make a connection between these two regions. And then we have a network and can do all our networks. So that's a very simple approach. And now let me make some jump going to this, what we have done very recently. We took now real data. Also if you will go for 60, 70 years, you have to take reanalysis data. But if you are interested only in the last 20 years, then there are good satellite data. And for rainfall is this so-called TRIM data from a satellite with measures with very good accuracy and homogeneously the rainfall in a belt around the equator, I think plus minus 50 degrees or so. And this has a very good time resolution, 0.25 degrees, which leads to more than 500,000 grid cells. And then we make, as I told you, this synchronization analysis. This is pairwise, region by region, also grid by grid, always pairwise. If you are doing this, then you have to make 10 to 11 comparisons. This is no problem for good computers these days, but the problem is at a different point. This is a so-called multiple testing problem, because you take each data set, each time series, very often for comparison, not only once. And then that means you take it in multiple, highly multiple time, and this leads to a random connection. It is significantly connected, but it is not, only due to this problem of multiple testing. And this is a classic problem in statistics. There are corrections, Bonferroni and other ones, but they are too conservative. They do not apply for our system. Nothing would remain, and this cannot be. And therefore, the main work we did in this paper was to develop here a method how to overcome this multiple testing problem. And we changed a bit the approach, not to consider pairs, but to identify significant bundles. Because the rain cannot jump from Curitiba to Sao Paulo, as the clouds have to go via a flow. And this is what we try to identify, the flow. And then, of course, also further ahead. And this is the main idea, and you can interpret this as a generalized conditional causality, if you wish. And this really leads to, we did a lot of analysis and testing, this really leads to significant and serious results. So, and this only to give you one first insight, we considered the connectivity from what we call South Central Asia region, which is North India, Nepal, North Pakistan, and Tibet. And this we put together and looked where is such synchronized event from there to other ones. If we take it in the original version, then it looks, this is here the belt of observations, plus minus 50 degrees, and it looks so that this is connected to all the other areas. This cannot be. This is too much, as one has to correct. And here is then what we get out after the correction. All these hatched areas, forget about, there are only a few coincidences, a few synchronized events happened, we neglect them. Also consider only the red and the blue lines, is now much less, and you see that there are a lot of connections in the rather short range, these are the red ones, but you also have long-range connections, not jumps, but connections. And this was a bit surprising. You have a lot in the what reflects the monsoon system, also in the equatorial area, but also in the extratropical, going to North America, going to Europe, and also going to extratropical areas in the southern hemisphere. So the question is now, how can we interpret, what can we do? First, we made a statistics of the scaling now all connectivities pairwise again and calculated the power density function. And it turns out that we have, this is in the log plot I do not like, and it's not important that it looks here like a straight line. Important is only that you have some kind of scaling till a distance among the nodes of about 2,500 kilometers, and then surprisingly, or in some sense surprisingly, you have a strong change. That means now for the long-range connections, you have much more than expected. First, one would expect it goes in some sense, maybe with some variations further down, but it does not. You have then really much more teleconnections than expected. And this, of course, has some reason. And let me look, what do I have next? Yeah, the first thing is that this red, this rather small, also till 2,500 kilometers, reflects the regional connectivity. And the longer ones reflect the teleconnections and is strongly related to the global circulation dynamics and especially to the Rossby waves. We have done then, this is more than thermodynamics, this is more circulation, global circulation dynamics. And this is what we did. Then we made a comparison by spatial averaging this area and then some part of Europe, and found some alternating structure among these two areas, which looks very much as Rossby waves, and this was too much, looks very much as Rossby waves, and this is also called the Silk Street, and because this is a relation from the Atlantic till the Tibetan plateau, and this is due to the Rossby waves. You have then an increase of special severe events, and this leads then really can lead to heat waves or to very strong precipitation. Also again, we have a power law like, this is not important power law, but some scaling at the shorter scale, and for the longer range scale, you have really a different kind of connectivity, and we have found then by really carefully comparing also with wind data, not only precipitation data, have found that this is controlled, this longer range, by upper level Rossby waves. And what is also very interesting is this connection to North America, which is a bit more difficult. To Europe is via the Rossby waves. This is probably via Africa and the Atlantic Ocean, and also to the southern hemisphere. And the main point is, these are, if you wish, the first global results. But in general, this opens now new ways for prediction of extreme rainfall events. And this one has to look then really in more detail, which we have not done so far, but this is what we can do next. And I will give you, I have a bit of time here, give you one example of this. This is for the South American monsoon system. We again take the TRIM data, here a bit shorter interval, this resolution, and we take now only the 1% strongest events as extreme events. And here you know much better than me, then summer is December, January, February mainly, and we took only these 3 months. And our main problem was, is there some understanding of extreme rainfall in Bolivia, in these high plateaus, because extreme rainfall induces floods and strong landslides. There are some examples where you have a strong economic consequences, causes due to the strong rainfall. And the point is that so far there is no prediction at all. Zero. It comes from heaven, if you wish. No prediction, they try. And here, this is a typical example from a landslide. So you see, this is washed out immediately, and as a consequence, the water can go and can flood civilized areas. And it would be very helpful to evacuate people, and then a few days would be not bad. The question is there some prediction possible? So, and for this, let me, before coming to the networks, give a very short start with a typical climate and weather motion in South America. Most moisture is coming via the Atlantic into the Amazon area, goes this way, and then the Andes are here stopping. But it cannot stop, but it will be shifted, moved downwards, southwards. This is a typical direction. That means when you have rainfall, then is a very typical expectation, and very often it's true, that the rain is coming from north. Let me say this very simple. Rain is coming from north. So we made then our network approach. Now we consider also the directionality. That means what are things, what are sources to have directions of the rainfall. And we are interested in very strong rainfalls in the area where many of you, or some of you, came from, now from the Stadtfest-Conference in Buenos Aires, Montevideo. When there is strong rainfall, what happens? What is the reason? Where does it go? And when we apply our method, we find that it goes this way. Let me show in the next, is better. We start here, and then it goes step by step here up to these high plateaus in mainly in Bolivia. And one can, of course, also estimate the speed, which is about 80 kilometers per hour. That means it takes about 2 days from here till here, which is enough to evacuate people in some sense. So this was our finding. Then we went to our good friend José Marengo, and he's a real expert in this. And he told us, very nice result, but impossible, because rain is coming from the north. You are doing some crazy things, and it looks good, but it's... And then, especially Niklas Börs, who did most of the work, he looked for bugs in the codes, and so all was okay. We went again to him, and then Jose understood, these guys are not so easy to treat. I have to sit down with them and to look. And then we really sit together and found really a reason for this. And this is the following, that you have also Rossby waves, but now in the southern atmosphere. You have strong wind coming from the Antarctica, which is very dry, goes northward, and this is like a carrier. He takes the humidity from Buenos Aires northwestwards, and till these high plateaus, and then the rain occurs. This was then the, if you wish, the hypothesis. And then we, of course, you can make this, all was averaged quantities. Then we look to the special situations without all this network analysis, really to the original data, the wind data, the precipitation data. And we found that more than 60% of all such strong rainfall events in Bolivia are due to this mechanism. And during El Nino, even more than 90%, also almost all, if you wish. And this is also really, if you wish, a new mechanism is now accepted in also, Stefano also in serious journals as Climate Dynamics also, and GRL. And this has the mechanism with predictive power, in some sense. Also in so far is not beyond 2 weeks, but first time you can predict such thing. Also this is one power, and another one will be presented by Jelena tomorrow or something like this, for the Indian summer monsoon, which made a lot of noise in India and is also now accepted, but she will explain this in detail. Also, I hope I could convince you that climate network approach really helps in some situations, not always, in some situation. We can understand the propagation of extreme events and what is the origin of this, what is the reason, the mechanism, and then in some situations also have predictive power, as in the central Andes or in the Indian summer monsoon. And our hope is now, which is under work in India, because the people there are very open and very interested in to include this in operational forecasting. Here in Bolivia, it's a bit more difficult. But this is another story. I will not tell this again. Once I made a big mistake when I mentioned this. But what I have to say, this is many problems are unsolved. Also, I would say it's really in its infancy. I hope this with our graduate colleague we can solve further problems. One is we cannot predict the intensity. Last year was this very strong rainfall in Kerala shortly after the onset of monsoon. This year in your area and in Chennai, this we cannot predict now, but hope maybe together with all the knowledge from the Indian colleagues we can combine and can come not only to the onset but also to the intensity. Also. And there are further problems also to apply this to other areas. And let me mention only one other thing. And this is one for the extreme events. Another, which is related to extreme events in some sense, are so-called tipping elements in the climate system. It's known now that there are several areas, rather large areas, which are under much danger for qualitative changes. We would call bifurcations. That's called tipping. Also it can tip from the actual regime to another one. One is, of course, the Amazon rainforest, El Nino. Also here we are in the middle of a lot, both pole areas, then, of course, the Indian monsoon, the Himalaya, it's also the thermohaline circulation, and so on. Also it's known that if some changes will go on with the climate system, they can tip. It's unclear when, and there are many unclear things, but it's a very interesting problem to consider these special areas as nodes in a network, in a global network, not going to so much details. And then an important question is whether this, when one area, say the melting of Greenland, will tip the area, the climate there, whether it will end up in a cascading, domino-like behavior, or whether it remains isolated. Of course, one cannot believe it's isolated, but the question is, in which manner such cascading? Maybe it is only cascading to one or two neighbors, or maybe it's even more. This is one point which is also under study these days with the help of complex networks. So with this, I'm almost at the end. Here are our papers on this. And I will also make, as Stefano, some advertisement for another journal for chaos, and would like to mention you have not to pay to submit the first months after publication. You can download for free. But what I would like to mention is this fast track what we have, and the decision will be made during the first 30 days after submission. Also if you have a good result, you should, and if you are interested in a fast publication, submit there. With this, I would like to finish. Thank you very much.
Hi, Jürgen. Very nice talk. Your networks are very similar to my networks. I work in neuroscience, and yes, we are working with functional networks. So I was thinking about borrowing some techniques from climate networks. And in neuroscience, we have the problem of how to define a node. Because in brain networks, we have different regions that are very close doing the same thing. So it's difficult to define what is the size of a node. I was wondering if you are just working with the signals that you record, or you group them in a certain way.
Also one thing what we did, which I did not mention, is that you have the distance between the nodes are different. Almost done here. In the poles, the distance is much closer. And then we make a renormalization. This is one point in this direction, but this is clear here due to geometry. Otherwise, we thought about such things. One point is this clustering analysis. Maybe you could also do there. And another is what we have not done. In some critical areas, one should have more nodes, say close to the Andes, where there is something happening, or in the rainforest in Amazon, and also in Indian monsoon, close to Himalaya also. One should include more, and in others have more sparse. But this we have also not studied. This is one of the really open points. I think this could be one of the dimension reduction. Here we did only this simple, with which is straight, but it's not very intelligent, let me say, for this purpose. For other purposes, but for this could be really one, and I think it's the same problem and the same kind of mechanism in some sense.
And do you have an idea why they decided to use non-equispaced measurements? There is a reason for this?
This is some classic things that they have in the degrees is the same distance, but not in what is this? Not in geodesic. And they have the same differences in the degrees.
For the causality, Jürgen, you use the measures like the Granger's causality measure, or is there something better that you...
No, of course, these are the cross-correlation Granger are the basic things, but we made then some dependencies, I have not here, with the past. Also we call it the father and the grandfather, and so, and how is this related? And so far it's conditional, but in a way, in a nonlinear way, which is not with Granger. This is a generalization. Of course, the idea is cross-correlation Granger. These are the basic ideas, mutual information.
Jürgen, thank you for this very interesting talk. I have a question. It's about how robust are your findings to the definition of an extreme event. I mean, I saw that you defined it as a 90%, I think, or 10%. And I wonder what about if you define only 1% or probably 20% of the events? I wonder if the results are the same. What is your advice for
No, that's right. It's a very important point. Therefore, we took here from 90s till 99 percentile, and 10 to 1%. And really the behavior, the scaling, and also the main connectivity is unchanged. This was also a point. But we did not went more down. Then it would be not strong enough, let me say, in the rainfall area. With rainfall, you can do this. With other, it's not so easy. As rainfall in this manner is rather easy, let me say.
Well, thank you very much, Jürgen. So, our next speaker is Ricardo Martinez-Garcia, who is from Princeton University and will be joining the staff here at ICTP-SAIFR. Ricardo will talk about pattern formation in populations with density-dependent movement and two interaction scales. So let's see if we converge. All right. Where is...
Thank you. Thank you, Hilda. Thank you for the invitation. As Hilda said, I'm going to present some work that is actually from the end of my PhD, beginning of my postdoc, has already some time, but I thought it was the best fit for most of the people here, and also I'm working on extending it, so it would be great to get some feedback from you. So the idea, today I'm going to be talking about spatial patterns in different, well, in particular in one ecological system, but as probably many of you have in mind, these patterns appear on very different systems, and those systems are present on very different scales. So just to give you some examples in the case that you want to connect the ideas to different to systems that you may be more interested in. In the very small scale, we have these patterns of spatial organization in tissues. For instance, this is the coat of some insect cornea. This is the eyes of flies. And this is one of our fingerprints. If we scale up to larger systems, we have probably one of the examples that was studied earlier on time, which is the coat of some animals, two fishes here, for example, and a leopard. And on the largest scales, which are the ones that I'm going to be to focus more on today, we have this patterning covering like from few meters to even a couple of kilometers on these very, very larger scale patterns of organization, for instance, in vegetation, in semi-arid landscapes, and also in some populations, for instance, mussels, and this is some tiny insects that create these clusters that cover many centimeters, almost a few meters. So there are many different ways in which these systems self-organize. Probably the one that was proposed first, that was by Turing, was introduced by Turing, is this activation inhibition principle that basically says that we have two substances that react with each other in a way that one is an activator, so the presence of that activator enhances the production of more, and it's also enhancing the production of a second substance that is the inhibitor, that at the same time inhibits the production of the activator, right? And the difference between the diffusivities of these two substances lead to the emergence of these patterns. So basically, we can write this in terms of reaction diffusion equations, and depending on the nonlinear production and interaction terms, which are these f of uv and g of uv functions, we may have very different patterns. So this, of course, requires some population dynamics. So this requires the production and the elimination of individuals, of concentration, of whatever we are trying to understand. But there is another way in which these patterns form, which is actually the one that I'm going to discuss for most of the presentation, although I'm going to go back to this at the end. That's why I wanted to introduce it very briefly, which is the formation of these patterns through movement. And this formation of patterns is conservative in the sense that there is no creation or elimination of mass somehow, so the population that it is in the beginning, it conserves through the whole process, and at the end, the only thing that is changing is the spatial distribution of that population. And we can try to map this activation inhibition principle through a more attraction-repulsion principle in these models. And the one that I will be discussing today is the case of these spatial patterns of masses that you saw in the first slide, in which there's been some experimental work that has measured the movement, so the velocity of these muscles, as a function of the density in a given neighborhood. So basically what these experiments are doing is to focus on an individual, surround that individual by different population densities, and see how the velocity of that individual changes as we change both the radius of that neighborhood and the density of individuals within that neighborhood. So this first plot on top has a small range, so the neighborhood is 2 centimeters, and what the experiments found is that the velocity of the individuals decreases as we increase the amount of individuals within that neighborhood. On the other hand, if we go to larger neighborhoods, so we increase the radius of that neighborhood, and we repeat this same experiment, what we find is the opposite trend. So as we increase the region of the neighborhood that is covered by muscles, then the population, or the velocity of the focal muscle is increasing. So basically, depending on the scale of the interaction, these muscles tend to either over-disperse or reduce their movement in response to the density of individuals within that neighborhood. There is a kind of a scale-dependent feedback here as well. So if we do that for a large population, so basically we placed several muscles within a given arena, and we allow them to move for 24 hours, what we find at the end is that they self-organize in these kind of patterns that we saw in the first slide. So the patterns in the first slide were in the wild, in the Northern Sea. These ones are in lab conditions, but they pretty much look very, very similar. So the idea is, how can we incorporate these feedbacks into a theoretical framework that allow us to understand the interplay between these two scales in the emergence of these patterns? And what people did in this paper from 2008 was to create an individual-based model in which basically they have a discrete description of each muscle. Each muscle is a particle that moves according to, it's performing a random walk with this kind of two neighborhoods. And what they find is that they kind of recover the same spatial patterns. But if we want to have this theoretical construction to understand this problem, it's way nicer to have a continuous equation in terms of density rather than these individual-based models that rely a lot on simulations. So they tried to work out a little bit this problem to construct that continuous model. And what they come up with was a kind of a phase separation approach in which they have an equation for the evolution of muscle density, which is this m here. G of m is a function that is related to the velocity. And they were able to recover with this equation not only the shape of the pattern, but also some statistical properties that it has. But this approach has one inconvenience, and is the fact that relying on this kind of phase separation mechanism does not lead to patterns that are either stationary on time or that have a well-defined wavelength. And I'm going to come back at the end to discuss why I think that can be a potential problem. These patterns have coarsening, so at the end we have the wavelength of the pattern is going to grow over time. So the question that I want to address we wanted to address with this project was whether we can come up with an alternative theoretical framework that is able to reproduce these patterns and leads to stationary patterns that have a well-defined wavelength, basically. And our proposal is to start from the very, very discrete description of the system, so start from the microscopic description of these dynamics, and then scale up to a macroscopic description. So we start by considering that we have a series of particles that move according to these Langevin equations, the stochastic differential equations, in which the diffusion of, I'm always very bad saying that word, the diffusion of these particles depends on the position of the individual and on a non-local density of muscles on two different scales, basically. So on a more schematic way, what we have is a focal particle that has some short-range neighborhood and a long-range neighborhood. And depending on the non-local density of particles within those two neighborhoods, then the diffusion of the muscles is going to change. And of course, because we want that diffusion to capture this kind of a scale-dependent feedback, then we need to require that the derivative with respect to the short-range density needs to be negative to capture this kind of tendency to aggregate when they are in short-range crowded environments. And on the other hand, for the long-range neighborhood, we need to impose the opposite condition, right, to capture this tendency to over-disperse, basically. So our proposal is to choose a kind of hyperbolic tangent function with some shift in a way that when this difference between the negative feedback, I'm going to call negative feedback to the tendency to the feedback that promotes breaking the pattern, so promotes the dispersion, and the positive feedback that is going to be the other way, the opposite, of course, the tendency to promote patterns. When the difference between those two feedbacks is very large and positive, so the negative feedback is more important, then diffusion saturates to a maximum value. And when the difference is very large but favoring the short-range feedback, then the diffusion tends to zero. That's the kind of diffusion that I'm going to be working with. But in principle, as far as we impose these two conditions, we can do the same analysis in a very general way. So given these dynamics, the first thing that we can do is to simulate these microscopic dynamics and see how far we can go in reproducing this spatial distribution of individuals that we know appear experimentally. So when we repeat when we run those simulations for a given fixed population size and increasing the intensity of the positive feedback, so if you remember, alpha is the parameter that modulates the short-range non-local density. So basically, larger alphas give more weight to the short-range feedback in the diffusion. As we increase alpha, we observe a transition from an homogeneous population to the formation of these clusters, these spots of individuals, to a more labyrinthic shape for the patterns. And something that I want to point out is that these spots have a very interesting feature, that is the accumulation of individuals in the borders of the cluster. So instead of having like spots with individuals everywhere inside them, the particles tend to arrange in the border of the spots. I'm going to go back to this later because I think it's a very interesting property of the model. But of course, so far we haven't gained so much because I presented in the beginning this individual-based model that was pretty much essentially very similar to this one. And what we wanted to have is a macroscopic description, so an equation that describes the evolution of the density and allows us to do some analytical work. So the step that we need to do now is to move from this system of coupled stochastic differential equations to a partial differential equation for the density of individuals. And we can do that using a very nice approach introduced by Dean in 1996 that basically uses Ito calculus to do this kind of transformation. So if we do that, we actually get a very intuitive shape for the diffusion equation that tells us that the only thing that we have is a non-local, non-linear diffusion equation in which our diffusion with two interacting scales is inside the spatial operator, of course. And of course, because now we've moved from a discrete description to a continuous description, now this density of particles is given by this expression, and our kernel is still this kind of disks. So basically, we are not weighting the strength of particles in the interaction as a function of the distance. We are assuming that every single particle that lies within the neighborhood has the same weight in the interaction. So the nice thing of this equation is that we can not only, in addition to being able to integrate it and look into the patterns, we can also do some analytical work. But first, let me show you how these patterns look like when we integrate this differential equation, this partial differential equation. So what we observe is that we get the same sequence of patterns as a function of the intensity of the short-range attraction feedback. And very interestingly, we still get the same ring-like structure for these spots. So what we can learn from here already is that these rings are not so they are not the result of our model being stochastic, or they are not any consequence of the noise in the system. They are something that is true in the deterministic dynamics of our model. But now the strength of having this continuum description in terms of this partial differential equation is that we can actually do some analytical work. We can do a linear stability analysis on this equation, and we can see how the parameters of the model, how the different feedbacks are actually are changing the instabilities in our model, and how that's leading to the patterns, right? So if we do this linear stability analysis, which basically consists on assuming that our model is in a homogeneous steady state, and we introduce a small spatial perturbation. When we look at the growth rate of that perturbation, we observe that when the attraction feedback is very weak, then we don't have patterns because the growth rate of the perturbation is negative for every single wave number. But as we increase the intensity of that feedback, we get that first for intermediate intensities, we already get we already get the perturbation growth rate positive for some wave numbers, so we already have patterns. And as we I mean, and when we continue to increase alpha, we basically maintain those patterns. So this is just a confirmation of our numerical results that we saw in the previous slide. But there is something that this analytical analysis is telling us, and is that if we look into the very, very short wave numbers, which are enlarged in this inset, we observe that as we increase this alpha, so as we promote attraction between individuals, we have a change in the type of instability that our model has. So for intermediate strengths of the attraction feedback, we have an instability in which the perturbation growth rates for low wave numbers is negative, but then as we increase attraction, those small wave numbers become unstable. And this transition in the type of instability is very closely related to the transition between these spots of particles and these more labyrinthic structures. So basically, as we give more weight to the attraction feedback, what we have is this transition in the shape of the patterns, and by having this macroscopic approach, we can have analytical insight on when and why this transition is happening. So this is the first result that I wanted to discuss with you. The second one is the formation of these ring-like structures that we were already agreed, or at least I already said, that they are not the result of the stochasticity in our microscopic model, but they are something that is there in the deterministic part of the dynamics. And the best way to understand that, although it doesn't look from so many lines, is to start from a one-dimensional density profile. That is the black line here is this kind of hat function. This is the initial density of particles. Let's assume that in the beginning, this is how our density looks like. And then we can calculate the short-range non-local density, which is the red dashed line, and the long-range non-local density, which is the green dashed line. So the way I calculate these densities is nothing else but by this convolution between the kernel and this density profile, with, of course, the two different R's. So for the short-range non-local density, I have a very short-range kernel, and for the long-range non-local density, I have a larger range kernel. So when we have these two non-local densities, as we calculate our diffusion by this hyperbolic tangent function, what we get is a diffusion that has two minima that are placed in the middle of this initial hat of muscles, if you want to look at that. So of course, because in those two regions, the diffusion is smaller, as we allow the dynamics to run, particles will accumulate around these two minima, and then in the middle, because the diffusion is larger, we will have a source of particles from the inside of the ring to this minima. And just a very small detail, the only reason why I'm plotting this in a logarithmic scale is because I want you to see that this is, so the diffusion is not zero inside the ring. So in principle, these rings are not stable. They will disappear in the very long range. But this is going to depend on the choice that we make for the function. So this is appearing in our model because of our choice of the hyperbolic tangent. If we make a function that actually goes to zero, then these rings may be stable. Or if we make different choices, we can break these structures. So they are there, but they are not something that is intrinsic of our approach. And just to finish, I want to give you some ideas of trying to connect why I was introducing this approach and why in the beginning I said that having this kind of canhillier approach could lead to some problems at some point. So I want to look into these patterns of muscles. This is the picture of one very similar that we were looking at in the beginning, where we have a characteristic scale of 10 centimeters. But if we actually zoom out these patterns, what we observe is that muscles also create like very, very large scale patterns on the scale of several meters. So basically, when we find these patterns in some Google Maps image, let's say, we actually have a nested pattern. We have these kind of stripes that are aligned in the direction of the sea current, but we also have, within those stripes, we also have these very small scale patterns that are due to movement. So the idea is that here we have the interplay between a kind of population dynamics induced pattern, as the one that I was discussing with the Turing approach, coupled with a pattern that is induced only by movement, as the one that I was discussing in the beginning. So there is work trying to model these kind of nested patterns in different systems. They also appear in vegetation systems, but they all rely on coupling individual-based model for the movement-induced pattern with a kind of Turing approach for the growth of the population and the consumption of the resources. And when people have been exploring these models, they actually found that they are very important for the ecosystem level processes that are happening in these regions, because one example, for instance, is that in the particular case of these mussels, this is the outcome. I mean, from numerical simulations of this model, what the authors are measuring here is the density of mussels as a function of the amount of resources that the mussels have. So playing with the short scale pattern and the long scale pattern, what they find is that in the homogeneous state, the system, so the mussels, at some point, the population collapses as the amount of resources declines. And it does so through a discontinuous transition. When they allow this movement-induced pattern to form, they observe that the robustness of the system doesn't change pretty much, we can say. However, for the long-scale pattern, they do find that the system becomes more resistant because the population is able to survive in worse conditions when they have less food. And when they couple both patterns with each other, they find not only that the population is able to survive at even lower level of resources, but also that the size of the jump in this transition is also small. So the coupling between these two scales is very important in order to understand how these populations survive and how these ecosystems work. It's not only a fundamental interest that we may have in understanding the formation of these patterns. But the point is, of course, again, that this is using a coupled individual-based model with reaction diffusion equations. When they try to couple their Canhillier equation with this kind of reaction diffusion equations, things break down and they are not able to reproduce these patterns. So the idea is, how can we get this coupling between population dynamics and movement with a closed equation, if we can? And the second, how can we use that theoretical framework to study the impact of these multi-scale patterns in ecosystem-level processes? So this is kind of a closing question. With this, I want to thank you all for your attention. Also thank the collaborators in this project. It's Clara, who was an undergrad in Palma at that time, my PhD supervisor, Cristobal, and Emilio Hernandez, and also my postdoc mentor, Corina Tarnita, Simon Levine, and Juan Monachela, with whom I've discussed these ideas a lot over the last 5 years. And before I take questions, I think this was a good audience to make a very small announcement. As Hilda said, I'm going to start here in September. And if any of you know or are interested in starting or doing a postdoc here, I would love to meet you, because I'm looking forward to people to work in these kind of projects. So thank you very much, and happy to take any questions.
Questions?
Yes.
Hilda,
Yeah.
once you fix the
Excuse me,
alpha.
wait.
Okay, sorry. Once you fix alpha, which is the with the parameter alpha, does that fix the wavelengths of the various patterns that you observe?
So
and in particular, the size of the
wavelength of the.
Yeah. Right.
Well, this one. So the wavelength is given by the Fourier transform of the kernels. So it's basically given by the actual radius of interactions that you allow in the model, basically. So actually, this. the distance between clamps is given, it's very close to the long-range scale, and the diameter of the ring is given by the short-range scale. And I think it's because of this interplay between the slopes of the non-local densities that I was showing in the 1D toy model. And depending on the ranges, you have different intersections between the slopes, and that leads to.
And what about this one?
This one?
No, for the striations, yeah.
So this one, when you do the, you can analyze the periodicities in these patterns with the structure function. When you do the structure function, the stripe has the same wavelength, dominant wavelength, because basically the spacing between the stripes is kind of the spacing between spots, but the intensity you don't have such a clear peak when you look at the short wavelength, because they are more blurred and you don't have.
Okay, any other question? Okay, Ulrike.
Ricardo. So when you look at your different patterns and you look at your bifurcation diagrams, which you showed in the very last part of the talk, so then it seemed that these patterns are not related, so to say, with bifurcations. If you think about reaction diffusion systems, so like the ones studied by Meron on vegetation patterns and stuff, so these different patterns are all related, and so that means you have an instability of a pattern leads to another pattern and so on. Here in your approach, it seems that it is separated. So is this true, this observation, or is this only because of the example here?
So this, so in our model, we don't have, because our population is conserved, we don't look into these diagrams, and the ones I showed are not mine, so I'm going to try to answer from my understanding from reading their paper. So I don't think they do, they don't look into, at least from what I remember in the paper, they don't look into the same kind of bifurcation diagrams that Meron does in their papers. What they are doing here is basically, regardless of the shape of the pattern or regardless of everything, they plot the spatially average density of muscles as a function of the control parameter, which is the amount of resources. And because the idea that they have in mind is to kind of construct this, I mean, to see whether they have an abrupt transition and a catastrophic shift that people call. But they don't do an actual, like a more, at least from what I remember again, they don't do a more like rigorous analysis of the stability of the patterns using continuation methods, something like that. I don't think they.
Thank you very much.
Did you manage? Just 1 second. As a matter of fact, I really have to congratulate the organizers of StatFest because they asked the people to send them the presentation at least 1 day in advance. So we should learn from them. Okay. Our next speaker is Iberê Caldas from the Physics Institute of the University of São Paulo, in the other side of the city. And he will talk on Shearless invariants in non-twist symplectic maps. Please see, yes, now this. Wait a second. I have this under you. Recording. No. You have it there.
Okay, now it's working. Okay, good morning. I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to present this talk. And I'm going to discuss about the shearless invariants that act as transport barriers in Hamiltonian systems. So in Hamiltonian systems, usually, or many times, we investigate the transport properties in the Poincaré maps in the phase space. And in some cases, if there are non-monotonic profiles in the unperturbed Hamiltonian or in equilibrium, it may appear a barrier that decreases or forbids the transport from one part of the phase space to the other part. And these barriers, they appear whenever you have a shearless in the Poincaré map, a shearless position, or in other words, if the rotational transform, the rotation number, has a null gradient in some position in the phase space. In that position, you have this barrier. And the important point is to how they appear and for which parameters they appear and for which parameters they are broken. And also if there are experimental evidence. And to discuss that, I will use the most simple symplectic map with these properties. That's the standard non-twist map. So, but when I have a Hamiltonian system, in many cases, I can derive an approximated map similar to this one, or even equal to this one. So it can be considered a very important map, a very general map, in the same sense as you have the non-standard map, the twist standard map. So what we do in general, we have some models for fluids, for plasmas, or other applications. And we derived a local approximation where we know that we are expecting this transport barrier. So we derived an analytical map for that region. In this procedure, you can find an example in this paper published in 2007, the International Journal of Bifurcation Caldas. And how they are related to this profile, equilibrium profiles. Also, we have another example in the plasma physics and controlled diffusion. We present examples on that. And all these are always showing a property of the Poincaré map in the phase space. But in this approximation, we may derive an analytical map that describes locally this transport. And the most known map is the standard non-twist map. That's the main subject of this talk here. So this standard non-twist map was introduced in '93 by Del Castillo, Negrete, and Morrison to investigate the transition to global chaos. As we have seen the standard map, the transition to global chaos was investigated. They wanted to investigate for maps with this transport barrier. So they introduced this map to do that investigation. And they realized the importance of this transport barrier already in another paper in '96, the same authors. And also there was a paper published by Kurths and Risato in Physical Review in '98, where they discussed these effects. And then appear other papers like these two examples I'm writing here, emphasizing the importance of these transport barriers. So let's go to the map. So the map, the non-standard, the non-twist standard map is this one. Well, it's difficult not to find. I can't follow. No, I think it has. No, it's working here, but it's too here. Okay, thank you. So I have two variables, x and y. Usually they are canonical variables in the physical model. It could correspond to the action and to the associated angle. So you have here these two variables, and you have two parameters, two control parameters, A and B. So A is related to some equilibrium profile in the Hamiltonian system, and B is related to the amplitude perturbation in the Hamiltonian system. But this is already the Poincaré section. Let's describe the Poincaré section. So if I put here y and here x, I have to choose several initial conditions. For each initial condition, I iterate the initial condition, generate several points. So usually, I could have chaotic trajectories and regular trajectories, periodic or quasi-periodic. In this example here, I choose two specific values for A and B, and then I got this Poincaré map. This is the map obtained from these equations. So you have here a chaotic trajectory from one side. On the other side, on the top, we have also chaotic. And then we see several islands. In the center of each island, we have an elliptical point. And then we have hyperbolic points. We have other invariants here. But the most important for us is this red line. That's an invariant line, but it has some special properties. If I compute the rotation number for each invariant, if there are invariants in this region here we have invariants. So I can follow a line, a vertical line, and choose several different initial conditions. Keep one x, for example, x equals 0. I have a line. It's difficult to find to manage the red. No, okay. I was blocking the sign. Okay, now it's better. So I choose x equals 0. I imagine a line here with several initial conditions. For each initial condition, I have x equals 0 and a different y. So for each initial condition, I compute this function here, the average of delta x for a big number of iterations. I have this rotation number here. That's the increase, the average increase in x. And I have several y for initial condition, I can have this profile from the rotation number, omega, in terms of y, the initial y. And I observe the variation. And the important thing is that for this position, I have a maximum. So the gradient of the rotation number is 0. And I can find the y where this happens. Since I know x is equal 0, if I find the y, I can put here one initial conditions, and then I iterate and I get the red line. So the red line is an invariant, which is this important property that it has a gradient of omega is equal 0. And then let's change A and B and see what happens, because the problem here depends on the two control parameters. If I change the control parameters, I change the map. So let's see some examples. No, let's here. Okay. So here are 4 examples. In the first case, I have A and B with this value. For the second, I change slightly both A and B. And what we observe here, I have the blue line. That's the line of which the gradient of omega equals 0. So that's the shear. There is no shear in the space for this, in the rotation number. So that's the blue line. And in one side I have 3 islands on the top and 3 islands on the bottom. Changing the parameters, observing here, the island changed position. There was a reconnection. This island was on the bottom, now he is on the top. So there was a resonance, resonant bifurcation, reconnection bifurcation, and changed the position. But for the other parameters, this red line, the chaos increase, the chaotic region increase, and it remains only the shearless curve and another invariants nearby that curve. But they may, the curve may break. So for these other parameters, you have the chaotic region in all phase space. And the place where was the shearless curve, there is a strong stickiness. You see that the chaotic trajectory stays longer here than on the top and on the bottom. So this separation has consequence in the transport. Suppose I investigate the transport of particles in a phase space. So the particles could escape to the top, but they cannot escape to the bottom because they are separated by these barriers. So the shearless curve and the other invariants, the neighbors invariants, they constitute a barrier. They avoid the transportation through the barrier. And if the barrier is break, they have a total, the transport in both directions. So when you have situations in fluids in the atmosphere or in the plasma, confined plasma or other examples, this is an important consequence for the transport. So here's the same. You have another example. I put one initial condition in blue, and the chaotic trajectory cannot pass the barrier, and vice versa. If there is an initial condition in red, it cannot go to the other position. Here is the same. You recognize for a small change, we fix a parameter B and change the parameter A. For a small change, the barrier is broken, and you recognize a strong stickiness. Then the question is, what are the critical values? What are the critical values to break the barrier? So I put the two control parameters A and B, and these are the result. If I have a point like this, I have a parameter A and B, and for these parameters, I still have the barrier. But if I go to the other point, now the barrier is broken. So I have a chaotic global.
Isolated, or are they connected?
They are isolated. So I put to illustrate. I can do for any point that I choose. I have to investigate if the barrier exists or not. If there is a global chaos or chaos is separated by this barrier. So the white corresponds the parameters having the barrier. So there is if I pay attention to this critical separation, this parameter, that's the parameter space, not space. In the parameter space, I can pay attention on this separation here to find the separation and to know the critical values. And it's important to realize that a small change in A or B can pass from one region to the other, to the white to the colored region. So this may have consequence in the experience when you are observing the plasma or a fluid. You may change slight change in the equilibrium of the parameter A may change from created the barrier, or the barrier may disappear during an experience. And this has been often observed in plasma physics. So now to measure this separation, to determine this separation, there was a method proposed. There was a method proposed by John Green, and this has been applied to the standard non-twist mapping. In this work here in '96 by Diego Castillo, Green, and Morrison. And they obtained the separation in the area. You see here a piece of the separation. And the idea, they follow the periodic orbits near the separation between the two regions. And if periodic orbits exist, they might exist an invariant quasi-periodic between these two periodic orbits. And they could do a procedure that they could refine very much and determine very precisely this separation. That was, for example, that's amplification, so they can identify the separation curve in the parameter space very well. So that's the shearless curve, in fact. Well, now there was another paper after that by Celso Abud. It was a PhD of Celso Abud. And then they use another procedure to determine this curve. The procedure was based on the Slater theorem. If I have a circle, a unit circle, if I have a piece of a unit circle, epsilon, and if I start, I look for an orbit starting this point, if I measure the time, the recurrence time to return to this region, if the line exists, if it's a rational invariant, I can observe at most 3 different recurrence time. If there are more than 3, the line is broken. That's a theorem. So the idea, we use this idea to make an analogy. And it's a similar problem. We consider each invariant curve in the phase space and look for the recurrence. If we identify 3 recurrences, the invariant curve exists. If more than 3 recurrences, the invariance was broken. In this way, we were able to determine when the separation, this curve, is broken. For example, here, here there is a separation, here there is not. So we take points near the border, and for each point, we examine the invariant, if the invariant exists or not. If we find the invariant existing, so the barrier was not broken. Here we don't find any invariant anymore. All they were broken. So we were able to distinguish these 2 cases, and then we get the similar results. That's the parameter space, B and A. We have this separator here. White now is the global chaos, and the red is when the barrier exists. If we make a zoom, we can guess about the fractal property of this barrier. The question here, numerically or experimentally, that's enough to distinguish, but I guess the Green's method should be more precise because we could increase the precision having a systematic procedure, but that's a more mathematical physical problem or question than real application in physics, because here we have enough precision to distinguish this. Another way was more recently by Mosé Santos to determine this separation in the parameter space. And the idea was to examine the recurrence plot. That's much used in the last years to identify the recurrence. That's the same idea to identify the recurrence. And there are several algorithms that can be applied for this recurrence plot. One of them is the determinism. So measure how regular or how chaotic the time series is, a sequence of the iterations are. And doing that, we know how regular behavior is and how a chaotic behavior is. And then we can make a distinction. We go to the parameter, to the initial condition. We have X and Y are initial conditions. For each point here, I take initial condition and look in the recurrence plot. So we can identify in this region here, there is a barrier because it's more regular. Here and here are chaotic. In changing the parameters, we can identify when we have the critical parameters and the barrier breaks. And here are the results. It's similar to the Abud, and for this precision, is similar also to the Morris and the Green results. So the conclusion is that we have these invariant curves in phase space, in the Poincare map of phase space, and that avoid the global chaos and affecting the transport. And another thing, how much time do I have? 5 minutes, so I think I can comment other things. These barriers, they appears also has a secondary bifurcations. So if I have a map, I don't identify in the map the global transport barrier, change the parameter, it's possible to localize, to see that this smaller barrier are created inside the phase space. I go to the example here. So I have a small island in the chaotic region, and if I compute numerically the rotation number along this line for different points, I have this profile. There is no maximum, so there is no shearless curve. But changing the parameters, I may go to this situation where I have a minimum in the gradient of rotation number, so I can also localize in red a shearless curve. Here are other examples. So I can find this even in the standard map. That's an application for the standard map. In the standard map, we didn't imagine there were this kind of barrier, but they are. We localized at several points, and then we found also for the non-twist map, we found also secondary shearless curves. So inside the phase space, we still have these smaller curves. And finally, the last result is if this was submitted for publication by Amanda, Matthias, and collaborators. And if I have another map, a generalization of the standard non-twist map, I have another parameter P, and times Y to the fourth. So if P is 0, I have the usual standard non-twist map. But for different P, I have another kind of map. And for 3 different values of P, I compare the critical curve in the parameter space. There is some difference for small values of A, but for the other values, the critical curves are very similar. So we were able to observe this separation for this other kind of map. And to finish that, I just wanted to show some consequences, experimental observations, experimental evidence of what I was discussing. So a paper appears in '95 that's an experience in the tokamak called the TFTR in Princeton, where they have the rotation number of the magnetic field lines. The plasma is confined in a torus device, and there is a magnetic field confined in the plasma. If I count the rotation number of magnetic field lines along the radial coordinate, I have this kind of profile here, the rotation, essentially the rotation number in terms of R. And you see there is a minimum here. No? So, and whenever this happens, this can be produced, here is the plasma current along the time, the total plasma current. When they injected neutron beams, here is a neutron beam perturbing the plasma, they modified this profile, so they got this position, this minimum, and then they measured the particles that are transported, and you see the transportation decreases very much. So they claim that they create a barrier inside the plasma. They didn't they didn't wrote that it was a non-twist shearless curve, but they propose a barrier appears because the rotation number profile was not uniform. But that we know now the explanation for that. This is a regime, special regime for tokamak. Sometimes they realize experience with that. The last example, the second example, is another machine where we analyze the data from this machine from Texas, Elimac, in the University of Texas, in collaboration with the experimentalists who run the machine. And there were people from the Tolfen, Pereira, Zwingli, Guimarães, and me. We were analyzing the data. And this is the machine, and here is the magnetic field lines in blue. And this machine was planet was built to investigate the turbulence and the particle transport. And in this machine, they can control the electric field, putting a special extra potential, applying extra potential in these places here, so they modify the electric field. Anyway, they can measure very well the plasma flow in the vertical direction. Here, and when they change the potential in these plates, they change this profile. So for different potential in these plates, we can compute the transport measure. We can measure the transport. So here is the experimental results. That's the potential in the plate. So each value of the potential is a different experience. Here is the radial position inside the plasma. And we see that the transport in the white is almost null, so it's around 0. We have no transport in this region for this radial position that changes a little when I change the potential. But here we don't have transport. They will measure, as we know the plasma velocity, we compute the gradient of plasma velocity. And this gives essentially the rotational transform of the plasma flow. And we see that when there is a shearless flow, it's 0. It agrees with that. So in that experience, the creation of the barrier can explain why you have no transportation, particle transportation in this region. So I think that's the main results. Thank you very much. I lost one of the first transparencies I put to the main collaborators, and now I realize I didn't show the main collaborators. So all these results were done in collaboration with F.U. Morrison from Texas, and Ricardo Viana from Curitiba, and Batista Danilo from Ponta Grossa, and the other postdocs also, and my postdocs.
Thanks, Iberê. Any question? Well, I'm sorry, Nilima. Yeah.
Are there any analogs for 3D volume preserving systems?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Are there any analogs for three-dimensional systems?
Three-dimensional? A three-dimensional map? Or?
Yeah.
Yes. We haven't done that. I know there are some, Jamie Miss have presented generalized for non-twist maps in 3 dimensions. Yes, there are. But it's not so common. It's a few papers appears in the last years. It's a very nice investigation. But
any other question? Okay, then we go to the coffee break. And we'll try to be here by, let's say we are already running late, but let's say 11:05. Coffee place is going out. If there is a stairs here, or go out through that door, cross the bridge, and that will be the place.
That's where I load?
Yes, in that computer.
That computer.